She stood in the courthouse hallway with her father's cooling hand slipping out of hers, as if the decision they were about to make was draining the last bit of warmth from both of them. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, too bright, too harsh, catching on the thin sheen of fear in her eyes. Down the hall, a man in a dark coat waited still, unreadable like someone preparing for a ceremony he didn't believe in. Emily tried to steady her breath, but the air felt tight, almost metallic. The smell of old paper and polished floors pressed around her, mixing with the ache of knowing this moment would cut her life cleanly into before and after. She was 38, old enough to know that choices made out of love could still feel like surrender. What hurt most wasn't the marriage contract waiting on the table. It was the quiet truth that she wasn't walking toward a future, she was trading pieces of herself to save what little she had left. And yet, the man waiting for her didn't look victorious. He looked lonely. If you've ever stood on the edge of a decision that felt too big, too heavy, too late, this story may feel familiar. Let's begin. Her father's hand slipped from hers, colder than usual, as if the decision had drained the last warmth from both of them. Emily barely noticed the courthouse air conditioning humming overhead. All she felt was the hollow ache that had settled inside her chest the moment they walked through the double doors. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, and the fluorescent lights washed everything in a pale, unforgiving glow. Her father shifted beside her on the wooden bench, trying to mask the tremor in his fingers. But she saw it. She always saw it. She kept her eyes on the scuffed tile floor, tracing the thin cracks like escape routes she would never take. At 38, she thought she understood all the ways life could corner a person, yet somehow this felt different. This felt final. She tightened her jaw, swallowing the bitterness that kept rising in her throat. She'd promised herself years ago she would never lose her independence again. And now, here she was, giving it away with a signature. Her father let out a breath that sounded like an apology, though he didn't say the words. He didn't have to. She knew what he carried: every miscalculation, every late-night worry, every debt he hadn't meant to create. The collapse of his small manufacturing company was written in the slump of his shoulders. His heart condition had only worsened in the last few months, and she had spent too many nights listening outside his bedroom door, terrified by the uneven rhythm of his breathing. She couldn't save everything, but she could save him. Footsteps echoed at the far end of the hallway, slow and steady, and she felt her spine stiffen before she even lifted her head. Jonathan Pierce turned the corner with the composure of a man walking into a boardroom instead of a courthouse. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him with precise intention, not a wrinkle in sight. His expression was unreadable calm, almost detached, but something in his eyes watched her with unnerving focus. He looked older than the photos she had seen. Not old in a diminished way, more like life had sharpened him rather than dulled him. 47. But he carried himself with the gravity of someone who'd learned everything the hard way. His steps didn't falter when he saw her. If anything, he seemed to settle more firmly into himself. Emily couldn't meet his gaze for more than a second. It was too steady, too knowing, as if he could already see the parts of her she kept hidden from the world. "Emily," he said quietly, offering a polite nod to her father before turning his attention back to her. His voice was even, dismissing neither the tension nor the discomfort in the air. "The judge is ready." She rose slowly, her legs unsteady. Her father tried to push himself up too quickly, wincing as he braced against the bench. She reached out to steady him, but Jonathan moved a fraction faster, supporting the older man's elbow until he regained balance. Emily felt a flash of resentment tighten her breath. He always moved like that, controlled, capable, impossible to ignore. "Thank you," her father murmured. Jonathan gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, then stepped back. Emily swallowed hard and smoothed the front of her navy dress with trembling hands. She had chosen the plainest thing she owned, nothing romantic, nothing hopeful. They walked toward the judge's chamber in strained silence. Emily kept a step ahead, her pulse thudding under her skin. The hallway stretched endlessly, each footstep echoing, each echo sounding like the closing of a door behind her. She stopped outside the frosted glass door, drawing a shallow breath. Her father moved to stand beside her, his hand unsteady as it reached for her shoulder. She covered his hand with hers, squeezing gently. "It's all right," she whispered, even though they both knew it wasn't. Jonathan stood a few feet away, waiting, always waiting. His patience unsettled her more than any display of impatience could have. What kind of man waited this quietly for a marriage like this? When the bailiff opened the door, she stepped inside, her heart beat loud in her ears. The room was small, dimly lit by a single lamp on the judge's desk. The judge greeted them with the detached warmth of someone who had performed similar ceremonies many times before. There was nothing special about this moment except what Emily was sacrificing in it. She barely heard the beginning of the vows. Her thoughts blurred into a quiet panic, the kind that didn't show on her face but churned beneath it. She answered the judge's questions with a calmness she didn't feel. Her father watched her from the corner, his features tight with both guilt and relief. Then came the moment she dreaded. "Emily Warner," the judge said, "do you enter into this marriage of your own free will?" The words cut through her like cold water. Of her own free will. She could lie, she could scream, she could walk out. All choices, none of them real. Her throat tightened as she felt her father's gaze on her, felt the weight of his failing heart pressing against her conscience. "Yes," she whispered. It sounded like a confession. The judge turned to Jonathan. "And do you, Jonathan Pierce, enter into this marriage of your own free will?" "Yes." He didn't hesitate. She wondered why. The question stung more than it should have. When the judge instructed them to exchange rings, her pulse stuttered. Jonathan stepped closer. The scent of cedar and something darker, maybe cologne, maybe simply him, reached her before his touch did. He took her left hand with deliberate gentleness, guiding the cool metal ring onto her finger. Her breath caught when his thumb brushed her skin. It wasn't a possessive touch. It wasn't even confident. It was strangely soft, almost careful, as if he were afraid she might break beneath his hand. The unexpected tenderness sent a jolt through her, and she pulled back just slightly too quickly for her composure to hide it. He stopped, surprise flickering for just a second in his eyes before he masked it again. The air between them tightened. Something unspoken moved there, something she didn't know how to name. She placed the ring on his finger with trembling hands, unable to keep the distance she wanted. Her pulse thudded violently, loud enough that she wondered if he could hear it. The judge declared them married. It was done. As they stepped back from the desk, Jonathan paused before opening the door. His voice was low, meant only for her. "You don't have to be afraid of me." Emily didn't answer. She didn't know if she believed him. She didn't know if he believed himself. She only knew that nothing about this made sense, and yet she was bound to him, in ways she hadn't begun to understand. And somewhere beneath that confusion, a question pulsed like a bruise. Why would a man who seemed so untouched by emotion want a marriage like this at all? The phone rang during her last art lesson of the year, a sound so sharp it seemed to slice the quiet room in half. Emily froze, her brush hovering over a canvas streaked with soft washes of blue and green. She taught adults on Thursday nights at the community center, people searching for small pockets of peace just like she once had. Usually, she silenced her phone. Tonight, she hadn't. Tonight. It felt like the world had been waiting to break her open. She excused herself, stepping into the hallway that smelled faintly of linseed oil and winter coats. Snow drifted past the narrow window, catching in the yellow glow of the parking lot lamps. When she answered, her father's voice rasped through the line, thin, strained, wrong. I need you to come home." The words were simple, but something inside her chest tightened instantly. He didn't say what was wrong. He didn't need to. She could hear it in the pauses, in the short breaths between sentences. She grabbed her coat and apologized to her students, her voice shaking without her permission. The drive from the small Wisconsin town, where she taught, back to her childhood home, took 40 minutes. Snow blanketed the two-lane road, muffling the world into stillness. Her wipers clicked a steady rhythm as she tried to breathe through the panic creeping up her throat. The last time her father had asked her to come urgently was the night of his first cardiac episode. She remembered the scent of antiseptic, the beeping machines, the way he'd apologized for scaring her, even as he lay hooked to oxygen. She found him in the kitchen, sitting at the table where he'd once taught her how to mix paints. Tonight, he looked smaller, his shoulders slumped as if carrying a weight too heavy to hide. Piles of papers, bank statements, medical invoices, formal letters with sharp fonts covered the table like debris after a storm. He tried to smile when she walked in. "Hey, sweetheart," but his voice cracked. That was when she knew the truth was worse than anything she'd imagined. He told her everything slowly, as if each sentence cost him breath. The fraud investigation, the frozen accounts, the possibility of losing not just the company, but the house, and then the medical bills, stacks of them. Reminders of a heart condition he'd sworn he was managing. Emily sank into the chair across from him, hands trembling in her lap. The bright overhead light cast harsh shadows on the exhaustion etched into his features. She felt the room tilt slightly as though she were standing on a ship suddenly caught in a storm. "You didn't do anything wrong," she whispered, her throat tight. "Tell me you didn't." "I made mistakes," he said, trying to keep the company afloat. "I cut corners. Foolish corners, nothing malicious, but enough to draw attention, enough to ruin us." The kitchen felt colder. The old furnace rattled through the vents, but didn't seem to reach them. She wanted to scream, not at him, never at him, but at life, at fate, at the cruel way problems piled on top of one another until good people suffocated under the weight. Instead, she leaned forward and held his shaking hands. "We'll fix it," she said softly. It was instinctive, the way she always tried to reassure him, the way she reassured her mother before she passed, the way she reassured the students she taught. Always the one stitching the world back together. He shook his head. "It's too far. They're talking prosecution. Prison time." His voice faltered. "I don't have years to spare fighting this." Her breath stopped. For a moment, she felt the familiar panic claw at her ribcage, the same panic she carried since her mother's illness, since the months of caretaking she'd buried deep inside herself, the terror of losing someone who was the last thread connecting her to the past. Then he said a name she had only heard in business stories, whispered with a mix of awe and caution. "Jonathan Pierce, he's willing to intervene," her father said. His firm could buy out the debts, handle the investigation, make it disappear. How, she asked, though part of her already knew. Her father couldn't look at her when he answered. He suggested marriage. The word hit her like cold water. She blinked once, twice, trying to process the absurdity of it. Marriage. Not a partnership, not a contract she could negotiate. Marriage. Her father rushed to explain, voice cracking under the weight of shame. He said it would stabilize everything, restore trust in the board. He wants a structured arrangement, nothing forced. He promised that. Emily stared at him, unable to speak. Her mind flashed to the quiet nights she spent painting, the little life she'd built simple, peaceful, chosen. She'd walked away from the corporate world after it drained the color from her spirit. Now she was being pulled back into something far darker. Her father's breathing turned shallow. He reached across the table, gripping her wrist, tears glistening in his tired eyes. "Emily, I'm begging you," he whispered. "I don't want to leave you alone. I don't want to go to prison. This is the only way." It was the breaking of a man she loved, a sound she had never heard before, a sound that fractured something inside her own chest. She tried to breathe, but the air felt thin. Her future flickered before her, a courthouse wedding, a stranger's ring on her finger, a promise she didn't choose. And yet, how could she say no? How could she risk losing the last family she had? Her father squeezed her hand again, his voice trembling. "Tell me you'll think about it." She nodded. Though the room spun, she would think about it. She would think about it all night, and the next night, and every night until she made the choice, she already knew was forming like a bruise inside her. As she drove home through the falling snow, her headlights cutting narrow tunnels of light through the darkness, one question pulsed again and again, quiet, desperate, impossible to silence. Was she doing this to save him, or because she couldn't bear the thought of being left behind, with no one left who still needed her? She signed her name so hard the pen nearly cut through the paper. The thin black line of ink trembled at the end of her signature, a small testament to everything she was forcing herself not to say aloud. The courthouse room smelled faintly of cardboard files and old carpet, and the winter wind rattled the window panes, as if trying to break in and rescue her from her own choices. The clerk slid the final document into a neat stack and offered a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Emily managed a nod. She didn't trust her voice. Her father sat near the wall, exhausted and pale, his breathing shallow despite the warm air. Seeing him like that, fragile in a way she never imagined, made her chest twist painfully. She looked away quickly, before guilt could swallow the last bits of resolve she had left. Jonathan stood on the opposite side of the room, calm as ever. His posture was straight, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. He wasn't smug, he wasn't impatient, he was simply steady. As if this moment was just another agreement, another transaction he'd seen coming long before she did. The clerk asked, "Would you like a photo to commemorate?" "No," Jonathan said quietly, cutting her off with a polite firmness. "This isn't for show." Emily felt heat rise under her skin. His tone wasn't cruel, but it was final, like he had drawn a line she couldn't cross. She wasn't sure why it bothered her so much. Maybe because part of her had hoped he would at least pretend this was something normal, something two people walked into willingly. But pretending wasn't part of this marriage. He stepped closer, offering his hand to help her stand from the wooden signing table. She ignored it, pushing herself up on her own. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Surprise. Maybe. But he said nothing. He simply let his hand fall back to his side. They walked out into the narrow courthouse hallway. The beige walls and humming fluorescent lights felt painfully ordinary for such an extraordinary surrender. Emily felt the weight of the simple silver band on her finger cold, too tight, like it didn't belong to her. Her father approached with a sad, hopeful smile. "You look beautiful." She didn't. She knew she didn't. Her navy dress was wrinkled from sitting, her hair pinned back in a way that made her feel older than 38. But his voice trembled with gratitude, and she forced a small smile in return. "You should go home and rest," she said softly. "I'll check on you tonight." "I'm proud of you," he whispered, eyes shining. The words sank into her like stones. She didn't feel proud. She felt hollow, scraped out. When her father slowly walked toward the elevator, she stood in silence beside Jonathan. The courthouse suddenly felt too quiet, too bright. She could hear the steady tick of a wall clock and her own uneven breathing. He finally spoke. "I'll drive you back to your place so you can pack." "I can drive myself," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "We should arrive together," he replied. "It looks more cohesive." Anger coiled in her chest, subtle but sharp. "Is that what this is about? Looking cohesive?" "It's about stability," he said. "For the board, for your father's situation, for everything except the two of them." She turned to face him fully. Then, "You don't have to pretend this is a partnership." His jaw tightened the slightest bit, the first real crack in his composure she had seen. "I'm not pretending." A hollow laugh escaped her before she could stop it. "Right." Jonathan's gaze held hers with an unsettling steadiness. "I don't expect affection," he said quietly. "Only honesty." His words landed like a weight. Not affection, not warmth, just truth. She should have appreciated the simplicity, the clarity. Instead, resentment surged up like heat rising from deep inside her. Honesty. He wanted honesty from her, after orchestrating the one choice she had never wanted to make. "You bought compliance," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "not honesty." The space between them seemed to tighten. For a moment, the courthouse hallway felt too small, the air too still. Her heart hammered, waiting for him to deny it, to defend himself, to say something that made this feel less like a transaction and more like a lifeline for her father. But he didn't deny it. He didn't say anything at all. His silence felt heavier than anger. It pressed on her, filling the edges of her thoughts with an unsettling truth she wasn't ready to look at. She took a step back, needing distance, needing air. Jonathan watched her with that calm, unsettling restraint she couldn't read. "Let's go," he said quietly. "We have a long drive." She nodded because she had no other choice. They walked out of the courthouse together, her father's safety hanging between them like an invisible chain. The winter wind cut across her face as they stepped outside, but she barely felt the cold. She felt only the weight of the silence Jonathan had left unanswered. Why didn't he deny it? Why had he accepted her accusation without a single protest? The question followed her down the courthouse steps, staying close, refusing to let go, just like the man she had tied herself to in ink and silence. Lake Michigan opened wide outside the glass walls. Beautiful, yes, but impossible to escape. The shoreline stretched like a silver ribbon under the pale winter sun, waves rolling in, slow, steady breaths. Emily stood in the entryway of the estate, her suitcase still beside her, the scent of cedar and polished stone surrounding her like a quiet warning. The house was magnificent, she could admit that much. But beauty didn't soften the tight feeling in her ribs. The ride there had been long, filled with a silence that felt too crowded. Jonathan had driven without music, without small talk, without even glancing in her direction, except for the occasional check in the rearview mirror. She didn't know if he was giving her space or if he simply didn't know what to do with her presence. Either way, she'd spent the hours staring out at snowy pines and winding roads, feeling herself drift further from everything familiar. Now, inside the house, she felt smaller than ever. The foyer opened into a massive living space lined with floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything looked deliberate minimalist furniture, muted colors, clean lines that made her feel like she'd stepped into a magazine rather than someone's home. The lake seemed to press against the glass like an unblinking eye. "It's large," she murmured, instantly wishing she had chosen a different word. "It's practical," Jonathan said behind her. "Events, meetings, privacy, privacy." In a house made almost entirely of glass. She glanced at him. He was loosening his coat, revealing a dark sweater beneath, the kind that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He didn't look uncomfortable here. He looked like he belonged every inch the man who commanded boardrooms and navigated crises with quiet precision. A house like this fit him. It overwhelmed her. A woman in her late 50s stepped out from a hallway, offering a polite smile. "Mr. Pierce, Mrs. Pierce, welcome home." Emily felt her stomach twist at the title. Mrs. Pierce, she wasn't used to it. She wasn't sure she ever would be. "This is Margaret," Jonathan said. "She manages the household." Margaret nodded warmly at Emily. "If you need anything, truly anything, just let me know." "Thank you," Emily replied, her voice soft. She wanted to disappear into her suitcase. Jonathan gestured toward the stairs. "I'll show you where you'll be staying. Not where we will be staying. Where you will." The distinction landed quietly, but deeply. She followed him up the curved staircase. The hallway upstairs was long and lined with black and white photographs she didn't have time to study. He stopped at a door and pushed it open gently. "This will be your room," he said. The room was beautiful soft cream walls, a large window overlooking the lake, a bed that looked like it had never been used. A vase of fresh winter lilies sat on the nightstand, their scent soft but unmistakable. "You have your own bathroom, walk-in closet, and—" he hesitated, as if anticipating her reaction. "Space to paint. The sunroom next to your room gets the best light in the house." She blinked, taken aback. "You set up a space for me." "You're an artist?" he said simply. She didn't know how to respond. She had barely told him anything about her classes, her students, the small life she'd built. She had assumed he didn't care to know. "Thank you," she said quietly, though gratitude tangled with unease. He cleared his throat. "There are a few things we need to go over." Of course there were. She braced herself. "In the upcoming weeks, we'll be appearing together at several events, charity functions, investor meetings." He spoke as though reading from an internal checklist. "It's important we present a unified front. People will assume things. Let them assume stability." The words settled over her like a second set of glass walls. "And if I don't want to attend something," she asked. His eyes flicked to hers. "Then we discuss it." "Discuss," she repeated, "meaning you talk and I comply." A subtle exhale escaped him, not annoyance exactly, but something close, meaning we make decisions that won't harm the company or your father's situation. There it was again. Her father always the anchor, always the chain. Emily took a few steps into the room, needing distance. Her breath fogged faintly in the cold air coming from the window. "I'm not a PR puppet. I don't want you to be." His voice softened, surprising her. "I just need things to stay steady for a while." She turned to look at him. His posture was straight, shoulders squared, but something in his expression seemed strained, not vulnerable, no, but weary, as though managing her expectations was harder than negotiating with shareholders. She pressed her lips together. "I'll do what's necessary, but don't expect me to smile for cameras." "I don't expect you to smile," he said, "only to stand with me." The words hung between them, heavy, layered, complicated. She didn't know how to interpret them. She walked toward the window, placing a hand against the cold glass. The lake stretched endlessly, its surface shifting with the wind. "It's beautiful," she murmured. His footsteps approached carefully. "You like open water. I like open space," she said quietly. He hesitated. "You'll have space here." She almost laughed at that. He didn't understand, not really. When she turned around, he was watching her with that same steady gaze that felt too direct, too intentional. It made her chest tighten. Then he said something that made the air tilt. "I've watched your classes." Emily froze. "Excuse me. Online," he clarified. "Some were posted on the community center's website. I followed them for a while." The room felt suddenly smaller, claustrophobic. "You watch my art classes." Her voice shook despite her effort to steady it. "Yes." "Why?" He held her gaze, unflinching. "Because you taught in a way that made people feel seen." Her pulse thudded painfully. The lily's scent grew sharper. She didn't know whether to feel flattered, exposed, or violated. His attention felt too close, too specific, like he had entered a room she hadn't invited him into. She stepped back, her throat tight. "You followed me before any of this happened." He didn't answer right away, and his silence felt louder than anything he could have said. Why had he paid attention to her long before their lives collided? The question echoed inside her, refusing to settle. She wasn't looking for memories, but the house kept handing them to her. Everywhere Emily walked, some small detail tugged at the corners of her mind, a wooden bowl like the one her mother once used for apples, a lamp casting the same warm glow as her childhood bedroom, even the faint scent of lavender drifting through the air vents. It unsettled her more than any display of wealth could. Luxury she could keep a distance from. Familiarity. That was harder. The evening light faded slowly over Lake Michigan, streaking the glass walls in long ribbons of copper and blue. The house had grown quieter after Margaret left for the night, leaving only the faint hum of the heating system and the distant, steady rhythm of waves brushing the shore. Emily wandered down a hallway she hadn't explored earlier, her fingertips gliding lightly over the smooth white walls. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe nothing. Maybe the last small piece of herself she feared might disappear in this place. A door stood slightly ajar near the end of the hall. Soft lamplight spilled out, warm and inviting. She pushed it open gently. The breath left her chest. Inside was a room she hadn't been told about, smaller, cozier, with wooden shelves lining the walls. Dozens of art books filled them. Some titles she recognized instantly, the same ones she assigned in her beginner classes, the same ones she kept on her nightstand for comfort during hard weeks. There were sketch pads stacked neatly on a table, jars of brushes arranged with care, and a set of oils she hadn't seen since she'd stopped painting large pieces years ago. She stepped inside slowly, as though afraid the room would vanish if she moved too quickly. Her fingers brushed over the bristles of one brush, soft, new, untouched. The familiarity of it sent a tremor through her. She felt exposed, almost as if someone had read pages from an old journal she'd forgotten she'd written. The window in the room looked out over the lake. The sky was fading into deeper shades of blue, a single star trembling in the distance. She stood there for a long moment, letting the silence thicken around her. She should have felt comforted by the room, but instead, a knot formed in her stomach. How much did he know? How long had he been collecting details about her life, her tastes, her habits, her memories? When she turned, she saw him. Jonathan stood in the doorway, leaning lightly against the frame. He wasn't imposing or silent in the way that made her tense. He was simply watching. Not studying her like a problem to solve, not assessing her for presentation or optics. Watching. With a gentleness she didn't know how to absorb. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said, though she wasn't sure if she meant him or herself. "It's your space," he replied, his voice quiet and steady. She took a small breath. "I didn't know this room was here." He nodded once. "I asked Margaret to prepare it a few weeks ago." A few weeks ago. The word slipped out sharper than she intended. He didn't flinch. "Yes." She looked back at the shelves, her pulse quickening. "These books, these brushes, they're exactly what I used in my classes. I know." "How?" Her throat tightened. "You knew that before all of this." He hesitated not long, but enough for her to feel the weight of the pause. "I paid attention." She stepped closer to the table, her hand resting on the edge as though she needed the support. "Why would you do that? Why would you pay attention to something so small?" "It wasn't small," he said. "Not to me." She turned to face him fully. Then, the lamplight cast soft shadows across his features, making him look less like the polished executive she'd married and more like a man carrying something heavy. Something he'd been carrying alone. "Jonathan," she whispered, unable to keep the strain out of her voice. "I don't understand what you're trying to do." His gaze dropped briefly to her hands on the table, then returned to her face. "I wanted you to feel familiar here," he said softly. "Not trapped, not out of place." The word struck her harder than she expected. Familiar. She hadn't felt that way in years, and yet, something inside her recoiled not from the kindness, but from the uncertainty of it. Kindness from him felt like standing on ground that could turn to ice without warning. "You could have just asked," she said, her voice quieter now. "You didn't have to study me. I wasn't studying you." His voice stayed calm, low. "I watched a few of your classes because the way you spoke to people, it stayed with me." She felt the room tilt subtly. Her heartbeat stuttered. "I don't know what that means," she whispered. He took a slow breath. "It means that before any of this, before your father came to me, before the contract, before you walked into that courthouse, you were already someone I noticed." The silence that followed pressed against her chest. She didn't know whether to feel flattered or violated, grateful or unnerved. His attention felt too close, too careful, too much like someone reaching through the boundaries she'd worked years to rebuild. And yet, part of her softened, just slightly, despite herself. She wrapped her arms around her waist, needing something to hold on to. "You can't make me familiar here," she said, her voice small. "I barely know who I am here." "I know," he replied quietly. She looked at him, really looked, and thought she saw something she had missed before. Not calculation, not control, loneliness, maybe as deep as her own. The thought unsettled her in a way she couldn't name. She turned her gaze back to the shelves, the paintbrushes, the books she loved, all the familiar things she didn't remember allowing him to know. Her breath caught in her throat as a quiet, unwelcome question slipped into her mind, refusing to leave. How does a man like him even know what familiarity feels like? He introduced her like a resume, not a wife. Emily felt the words land on the polished oak table with a dull thud, as cold and impersonal as the white tablecloth spread beneath the glittering dinnerware. They were seated in a private dining room at one of Traverse City's most exclusive restaurants, the kind with soft jazz floating through hidden speakers and waitstaff who moved silently as ghosts. Yet nothing about this evening felt intimate or gentle. It felt staged, calculated, sharp. Emily taught for several years at the community center, Jonathan said, his voice smooth, steady, businesslike. Her work with adult learners demonstrates adaptability and patience, qualities we'll highlight in the upcoming investor briefing. Investor briefing, adaptability, patience. Each word felt like it stripped another layer from her, leaving her exposed under the soft chandelier light. Across the table sat two board members, impeccably dressed, nodding as if evaluating her like a new hire. She clasped her hands together in her lap to keep them from shaking. She could feel the warmth of the candles, but none of the comfort. Her cheeks burned, though her expression stayed carefully composed. "That's impressive," one of the executives said, adjusting his gold cufflink. "Good optics. Makes the company look grounded. Practical, good optics, practical." She reached for her water glass, her throat tightening. Jonathan didn't notice, or perhaps he noticed everything and chose not to adjust anything at all. He continued, "Her background aligns well with the image we want to project. The board's been encouraging a more community-centered narrative. Emily brings that naturally. Narrative." He was talking about her life like it was a branding strategy. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She kept her gaze on the dark wood grain of the table, willing herself not to react. If humiliation had a temperature, hers burned hot enough to make her eyes sting. When dessert arrived, some delicate confection she couldn't bring herself to touch, Emily excused herself under the pretense of fresh air. The restaurant's hallway was dim, lined with muted landscape paintings. She pressed a hand against her stomach, swallowing down the ache rising inside her. She had married him for survival for her father, for necessity, but moments like this made the sacrifice feel sharper, deeper. She leaned against the wall until her breathing steadied. When she returned to the table, the men were finishing their coffee. Jonathan looked up at her, not unkindly, but with that same composed distance he wore like a second skin. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded once, though her chest felt pinched, her breath shallow. The drive home was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't restful, but brimming with unspoken things. Lake Michigan glimmered outside the passenger window, moonlight skating across its surface. She watched it, willing the calm to seep into her bones. It didn't. When they stepped inside the house, she moved first, walking past him without a word. The foyer lights cast long shadows across the floor. Her heels clicked sharply against the wood as she headed toward the stairs. "Emily," he said behind her. She didn't turn. "Emily." His voice deepened, not loud, but firm. She pivoted slowly, meeting his gaze. "Do you even hear yourself?" she asked, her voice quiet but trembling with contained heat. "You stood there tonight and spoke about me like I was part of your portfolio." His jaw tightened. "I gave context. You gave justification," she corrected, "for why I'm useful, why I'm appropriate, why I fit into the image you want to present. That isn't what I meant. It's exactly what you meant." She took a step closer, anger sharpening her words. "I'm not a strategy. I'm not something you leverage." He exhaled, running a hand over his jaw in a gesture that broke slightly from his usual control. The board needed assurance. They needed you to parade me like a product. His eyes flashed hurt or anger. She couldn't tell. "I would never parade you." "You did tonight." Silence snapped between them, taut as stretched wire. He looked away for a moment, his shoulders rigid. "You think I'm doing this because I enjoy it?" he asked, his voice low. "You think power protects me?" She stared at him, unsure where he was going. "I'm alone in every room I enter," he said quietly, the words cracking at the edges. "Every decision I make, every mistake I can't afford. You think that's protection?" Emily felt something in her chest jolt, not sympathy, not yet, but recognition. A flicker of understanding she didn't want to have, but the anger still pulsed beneath her ribs. "You don't get to hide behind loneliness after humiliating me." His eyes met hers, burning with something raw frustration, maybe, or something deeper, something he didn't have language for. "Emily," he said, stepping toward her. "I didn't mean—" She interrupted. "I don't want to be your narrative." The room felt too small, the walls too close. She reached for her wineglass on the side table, needing something to do with her hands, something to anchor her spinning emotions. But her fingers were trembling. The glass slipped. It hit the floor with a sharp, violent shatter, wine splashing across the polished wood like a dark bruise. The sound cracked through the house, slicing the tension open. She gasped softly, startled by the sudden eruption. Both of them stared at the shards, breath suspended. The moment felt like a fracture between them, within them, around them. Jonathan stepped forward instinctively, but she lifted a hand. "Don't," she whispered. He froze. Her heart pounded in her ears. She stared at the broken pieces, at the wine spreading slowly outward, and felt something inside her splinter in ways she didn't yet understand. When she finally looked up, her voice was softer, but steadier. "Was tonight the truth?" she asked, "or just another way to control the story?" He didn't answer. And his silence followed her as she stepped away, echoing through the long, quiet hall like the last fragment of glass still rolling across the floor. If she couldn't leave his world, she would learn how to survive inside it. That thought came to her the next morning, rising through the remnants of anger like a stubborn flame refusing to die. Emily sat at the long kitchen island, hands wrapped around a mug of cooling coffee, watching the early light crawl slowly over the lake's surface. The water looked gentler than she felt, soft ripples whispering against the shore, as if the night before had left no mark at all. Her thoughts, however, were jagged. The memory of the shattered glass tugged at her, mixed with Jonathan's confession lonely in every room he entered. She didn't want to feel anything about that. Not yet. Not when the sting of humiliation still pulsed under her ribs. She needed to regain her footing. She needed to stop being a prop in a story she hadn't written. She set her mug down and walked to the study, pushing open the double doors. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, landing on the marble desk where Jonathan spent most evenings reading reports or making calls. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped toward a shelf lined with binders and financial statements. They weren't locked, they weren't hidden, they simply waited there as if daring her to look. She pulled the first binder free, then another, and another, for hours. She sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by stacks of documents, her breath steadying as she read. Contracts, board minutes, public filings, nothing she hadn't seen versions of in her old corporate life. But the stakes here were far higher. Jonathan's company wasn't just a place of work. It was a fortress built from numbers, influence, and expectations. And like any fortress, it had fault lines. She found them slowly patterns in spending, shifts in board loyalty, pressure from stakeholders who wanted him to expand too quickly. It painted a picture she hadn't seen before, one in which Jonathan wasn't merely powerful. He was surrounded by people who benefited from his success without sharing the weight of it. By sunset, her eyes ached, but her determination sharpened into something clearer. She finally understood the battlefield she'd been thrown onto. When she rose to return the binders to their shelves, she sensed someone watching. She turned. Jonathan stood in the doorway, silent, unreadable in the amber light. She froze, heat creeping into her cheeks. She hadn't heard him approach. He didn't speak, but something about the tilt of his head made her heartbeat quicken. He looked surprised, not annoyed, not threatened, simply surprised. She swallowed. I was just, yes, he said softly, as though he understood without needing more words. The simplicity of it unsettled her even more. He didn't ask what she'd read. He didn't tell her to stop. He only watched as she placed the binders back in their precise order, her hands steady. When he finally stepped aside to let her leave the room, she felt his gaze on her back, curious, cautious, and something else she couldn't name. The next morning, she walked beside him into a meeting, an informal gathering of senior board members invited to the estate for a weekend strategy session. She had expected to remain silent on the sidelines, invisible. She had planned to observe, nothing more. But life rarely unfolded according to careful intentions. They sat around a large table overlooking the lake. Men in tailored suits reviewed numbers, projections, and market shifts. Jonathan's voice carried easily across the room, calm and sure, every statement clear and calculated. Emily watched him, realizing that in this environment, he wasn't cold, he was focused. The precision she hated last night suddenly looked like survival. One board member, a man named Weller, leaned back in his chair, adjusting his expensive glasses. The community program initiative, he said to the group, wasn't well received. The engagement numbers were disappointing. The demographic is not ideal. That's not accurate, Emily heard herself say. The room stilled. Her heart thudded painfully, but her voice remained steady. Those numbers reflect only the last quarter. If you compare them to the 6-month average, interest actually increased by almost 20%. The shift happened when the teaching format expanded to weekend sessions. Weller blinked, caught off guard. I wasn't aware of that. You can find it in the appendix, she said gently, nodding toward the report in front of him. Page 32. The room fell quiet again this time, with a different energy, the kind that pressed down on her shoulders and lifted her chin at the same time. Jonathan's gaze slid to her, and something unmistakable flickered across his expression. Not annoyance, not shock, recognition. He turned back to the table. Emily's right, he said simply, his voice calm. And it's worth considering her perspective in the larger strategy. Her breath caught. The discussion moved on, but the balance in the room had shifted. She felt it. He felt it. Even the lake outside seemed to hold its breath for a moment, as if listening. When the meeting ended, the others filtered out slowly, murmuring about forecasts and scheduling. Emily gathered her notes, even though she hadn't taken any. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from the strange thrill of having stepped into her own space again. Jonathan lingered near the window, one hand in his pocket, watching the water. She approached the doorway quietly, intending to slip away before he spoke, but he turned. You didn't have to do that, he said softly. Yes, she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. I did. He studied her for a long moment. The distance between them felt charged with things unsaid, gratitude, confusion, maybe even a kind of respect. When she finally turned to leave, her pulse still fluttering, a question rose uninvited, as sharp as the lake wind. Was she becoming his partner or his threat? The documents on the table weren't a trap, they looked painfully like a gift. Emily stood by the edge of the dining room, hesitant to move closer. Late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, laying soft gold across the wooden surface where a neat stack of papers waited. The house felt unusually quiet, as if even the walls were listening. Jonathan stood a few steps away, hands in his pockets, not pushing, not steering, just waiting. His restraint unsettled her more than any directive could have. He was rarely tentative. Tonight, he looked almost cautious. She finally approached the table. The papers were clipped with a simple black binder clip, nothing ostentatious, nothing glossy. The top page bore a heading, Pierce Warner Arts Education Foundation. She blinked once, then again, as if her eyes might be playing tricks on her. What is this? She asked, her voice quieter than she intended. A proposal, Jonathan said, for something I think you should lead. Her heartbeat quickened. She pulled the stack toward her and took a seat, slowly leafing through the first few pages. There were vision outlines, budget drafts, partnerships with community centers, grants for adult learners, mobile art studios for rural areas. Each detail was thought out with surprising care. No vague promises, no corporate fluff. It was thorough, too thorough. She felt him watching her, and the weight of his attention made the air feel heavier. "You prepared all of this?" she asked without looking up. "Yes," he replied, "over the last few weeks." She turned another page, then paused. "Before the wedding, yes." Her throat tightened. A strange mixture of warmth and unease spread through her. The careful structure of the proposal reminded her of the room he'd built upstairs, the one with her favorite books, her brushes, her memories. She wasn't sure if she wanted to lean closer to this offering or step away from it. She kept reading. The foundation wasn't a vanity project. It wasn't a PR move. It was real, something that could change lives, something that aligned with her, not with him. A knot formed in her chest. He was nervous. She could feel it even without looking. His silence wasn't cold. It was expectant, fragile in its own way. Finally, she sat back, pressing a palm lightly against the papers as though anchoring them. Why, she asked softly. "Why would you do this?" Jonathan exhaled slowly. "Because it's something you're meant for." "That's not an answer." He hesitated. She looked up, meeting his eyes. He looked almost vulnerable. "You told me once," he said, "that you left corporate life because it drained you, because you wanted to give something to people who didn't get the chance to dream bigger. I never forgot that." Her breath stilled. "I didn't tell you that. I told my class." He nodded. "I heard you." Her chest tightened further, not from discomfort alone, but from the unexpected tenderness of the admission. She lowered her gaze to the documents again. The details were compelling, thoughtful, but accepting something from him, something this generous, felt like walking onto unstable ground. "What would you expect from me in return?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, too quickly. She arched a brow. He corrected himself. "Only that you run it your way, that it becomes something you believe in." She studied his face carefully, the steady jawline, the slight tension at the corners of his mouth, the almost imperceptible shift when she took too long to respond. He wasn't trying to manipulate her. Not tonight, not in this. But the fear inside her was old, and it was stubborn. She turned the pages again, scanning the budget, these grants. They'd reach towns my mother used to talk about, places no one invests in. That's the idea. And the mobile studios. You've mapped out locations across the Upper Peninsula. You mentioned once that art reaches people where conversation can't. She stopped breathing for a moment. She had said that, years ago, to her students. She had assumed no one remembered. He had. She set the papers down, her hands suddenly unsteady. "Jonathan," she murmured, it's a lot. I know. I don't know if I can trust it." He nodded slowly. "Not defensive, not demanding. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't." She swallowed, the edge in her voice softening. "It feels too good. Good things can happen," he said quietly. "Not usually for me." He blinked at that, not dismissing her, not arguing, just absorbing the truth of it. Minutes passed, silent but charged, the lake outside reflecting streaks of fading pink and amber. She lifted the papers again, letting herself read more slowly this time. She imagined the faces of students young, old, uncertain, finding comfort in color, form, space. She imagined holding workshops, guiding hands, encouraging hesitant voices. She imagined belonging to something again. Still, one question pressed against her ribs, aching for release. She set the papers down and finally asked, "What do you get out of this?" This time, he didn't look away. "Something I've never had," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "Someone who sees the world the way you do." The room fell painfully still. Her breath caught. She didn't know what she had expected strategy, leverage, even guilt, but not this, not the raw honesty of it. She looked at him, her defenses wavering despite her best effort. He wasn't manipulating her, not in this moment. She could feel that in her bones. But believing him, that was something else entirely. She drew in a slow breath, clutching the edge of the papers as if they might answer the silent ache moving through her. Could she believe him? The question lingered unbearably, trembling in the fading light as she looked at the man who had upended her life, yet now offered her something she had lost long before he appeared. The handwriting was shaky. The truth inside was steadier than she was prepared for. Emily found the envelope wedged between two art books in the studio, upstairs, almost hidden, as if the house had been holding it for the right moment. Her name written in her father's old-fashioned script leaned slightly to the right, the ink lighter in some places, darker in others. She touched the paper gently, as though afraid it might crumble. Outside, Lake Michigan churned under a sudden wind, the waves shivering against the rocky shore. The house felt colder than usual, and she wasn't sure whether the draft came from the windows or from the envelope she hesitated to open. She finally slipped a finger under the flap. A folded letter slid into her hand. She unfolded it slowly. Emily, sweet girl. Her breath faltered. He had written it in the hospital. She realized instantly. The pen strokes trembled. The lines dipped unevenly. She could almost hear his breathing machine between the words. I know I didn't tell you everything. I know you'll be angry. I'm prepared for that. I deserve it. Her pulse quickened. She gripped the page tighter, her hands already shaking. I went to Jonathan long before the investigators called, before the company faltered, before anyone knew the truth but me. Her heart lurched painfully. She read on. I asked him for help. I asked him because I knew you wouldn't. Because I saw the years you carried me, carried the business, carried a burden no daughter should have to bear. A soft cry scratched the back of her throat, but she swallowed it. I didn't want you to go through another collapse. Not after what happened with your mother. Not after the years you lost. You deserve steadiness. I couldn't give it to you. I failed at that more times than I can count. The words blurred. She blinked hard, pressing the heel of her palm against her eye. He continued. Jonathan didn't force anything. I did. I begged him. I asked him to consider you, to take care of you, to give you a life where you didn't have to rebuild from ashes again. Her stomach twisted, a slow, deep ache. Maybe I had no right to ask. Maybe I was selfish. But he was the only man I trusted with the one part of my life I never got right, making sure you weren't alone. The room wavered. Her fingers trembled harder. Her father wasn't weak. He wasn't careless. He was terrified. Terrified of dying. Terrified of what she would face after. Terrified of leaving her without someone solid to lean on, even if the choice came wrapped in impossible knots. He had tried in the only way he knew. She pressed the letter to her chest, her breath shaking. For a moment, she couldn't read more. She stood, staring at the lake through watery eyes, the horizon blurring into the sky. The wind rattled the windows faintly, a sound that reminded her of hospital nights spent listening to machines beep in patterns that felt like countdowns. She returned to the letter. I know you think Jonathan is cold, but people like him, they don't show softness. They show responsibility. They show consistency. That's their language of care. You'll learn it if you let yourself. Her knees weakened. She sank onto the small bench by the window. I don't know how much time I have left. So I'll say this plainly. I didn't sell you. I didn't trade you. I trusted him. And if I was wrong, then that mistake is mine, alone, not yours. Tears slipped down her cheeks, warm trails cutting through the tension in her face. Her father had carried guilt she never meant for him to hold. Forgive me, Emily, for the debts I made, for the choices you had to clean up, for the fear I've put in your voice these last years. Her chest collapsed inward. Live in a way I never learned to. Find something that makes you feel alive again. Let someone see you, if they want to. Her breath stuttered. And don't spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for the things I broke. The last line was lighter than the others, the ink fading as if he'd run out of strength. I love you, in ways I never said enough. The signature wavered, barely legible. Emily lowered the letter, tears gathering and falling silently, dropping onto the wooden floor like tiny shards of something fragile breaking free. She pressed her palm against her mouth to keep from making a sound. The truth hit harder than any blow. The marriage wasn't blackmail. It wasn't coercion. It wasn't some desperate trick. It was a dying man's plea, a father's last attempt to build a safety net for the daughter he feared would collapse under another wave of loss. And Jonathan had said yes. She didn't know whether that made her feel relief or betrayal, love or resentment. Every emotion tangled with the next until she couldn't separate them. Her father had trusted Jonathan, trusted him more than he had trusted anyone in years. And she had spent weeks hardening herself against a man who might not have been her captor at all, but her protector. The room grew dim as a cloud crossed the sun. Shadows dipped across her hands. The letter, the floor. She stared at the ink again, tracing the lines with trembling fingers. A broken sound escaped her, small and raw. She covered her face, shoulders shaking as the truth poured through her like a tide she couldn't hold back. She wept for her father, for the choices he made, for the love he never learned to say, for the fear he carried alone, and for the part of herself that had never stopped needing him. Minutes or hours passed before she could breathe without breaking. When she finally looked up, her eyes swollen, she whispered into the empty room, "What do I do now?" There was no answer. Just the letter in her lap, trembling with the last truth her father would ever give her. Could she forgive Jonathan? Could she forgive herself? The questions settled around her like unfinished prayers, quiet, heavy, waiting. Jonathan's voice cut out mid-sentence, then the heavy thud shook her. Emily spun toward the sound, her heart lurching as she saw him slump sideways against the edge of his desk, papers scattering like startled birds across the floor. His phone slipped from his hand and hit the wood with a sharp clatter. Jonathan. Her voice cracked. He didn't answer. She rushed to him, her pulse thundering in her ears. His eyes fluttered, unfocused, his breath shallow. For a second, she froze, fear locking her in place before instinct took over. She caught his shoulders, lowering him gently to the floor. "Jonathan, can you hear me?" She leaned in close, feeling the tremor in his breath. He tried to speak, but the words collapsed into a low groan. His skin was clammy, pale, his shirt damp at the collar. She had seen stress in him, hard edges, sleepless eyes, but not this. Not the unraveling of strength. "Stay with me," she whispered, fumbling for her phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed. The dispatcher spoke calmly, but the world had narrowed into a tunnel, every sound muffled except her own breathing. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics carried him out quickly, their movements efficient and practiced. Emily followed close behind, her hands cold, her mind racing. His head rested against the gurney, eyes closed now. The rise and fall of his chest was slow, too slow. She hadn't realized she was holding her breath until a paramedic gently guided her aside so they could load him into the ambulance. "You can ride with us," one of them said. She nodded, climbing in. The doors shut behind her, sealing them into a space that smelled of antiseptic and urgency. The sirens wailed as the ambulance sped through the darkening streets. Emily gripped the rail above her, watching the paramedic monitor his vitals. "He's hypertensive," the man murmured, "and he's been ignoring it for a while." Ignoring it? Of course he had. Power didn't protect him. It isolated him. He had said that. She hadn't believed the weight of those words until now, seeing him lying there, shoulders sagging under a burden he rarely admitted he carried. Her father's letter echoed in her chest. He doesn't show softness. They show responsibility, consistency. That's their language of care. She swallowed hard, blinking away the sting behind her eyes. At the hospital, they rushed him into an exam room. Emily stood just outside the curtain, her hands clasped tightly, nails digging into her palms. Doctors moved around him in quick motions, checking heart rate, pressure, administering medication. She could hear their calm urgency. He's been under severe stress, blood pressure dangerously high. We need to stabilize him. The words drifted in and out, but the fear tightened, sharp and unyielding. She waited for what felt like hours, though the clock said otherwise. When a nurse finally stepped through the curtain, Emily straightened. "He's stable," the nurse said gently. "You can sit with him if you'd like." The breath Emily released was shaky. She followed her into the room. Jonathan lay against a slightly elevated pillow. The lines of tension softened in unconsciousness. The harsh fluorescent light made him look older, more vulnerable. She had only known him as impenetrable, composed in meetings, unshakable during conflict, a man who seemed carved from resolve. Now he looked human in a way that terrified her. She pulled a chair close and sat carefully. For a long moment, she just watched him breathe, slow and labored. The monitors beeped steadily, filling the silence. A memory flickered her father, lying in a similar hospital bed. The constant rhythm of machines filling the room. The smell of sterilized linens. The helplessness. She had promised herself she would never love someone she could lose in another hospital room. And yet, here she was. She reached for the edge of the blanket, smoothing it with a trembling hand. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "You can't scare me like that," she murmured. He didn't open his eyes, but his fingers twitched slightly against the sheet. She stared at his hand for a moment, large, still, so often clenched in control. She had never touched it without being prompted, without him reaching first. Her father's letter pressed against her heart like a steady hand. A new fear rose inside her, quiet but undeniable. She might lose him before she understood what he had come to mean to her. She inhaled slowly, her breath shaking. Then she did something she hadn't allowed herself to do, not once since their wedding. She reached for his hand, not out of obligation, not out of duty, but because the thought of him waking alone without anyone there to ground him felt unbearable. Her fingers brushed his first, then curled gently around his palm. The warmth of his skin surprised her. He stirred faintly, a soft exhale slipping past his lips. The first touch she had initiated. Her chest tightened, emotions rising too quickly to name tenderness. Fear, something deeper she wasn't ready to fully see. She held on anyway, gently but firmly, as if anchoring him back into the world. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. She leaned closer, her forehead almost touching the back of his hand. "Please don't go anywhere," she whispered. The words slipped out before she could catch them. In the deep breath, he drew afterwards slow, uneven, but present. She felt something shift, something neither of them could take back. Was this where everything changed? She wasn't ready to answer, but she didn't let go of his hand. Rain tapped against the hospital window like someone knocking, asking to be let in. The room was dim, lit only by the small lamp above Jonathan's bed. Emily sat beside him, her shoulders wrapped in a thin hospital blanket the nurse had offered. She hadn't intended to stay this long, but the storm outside made leaving feel wrong, as if the night itself held the two of them in place. Jonathan stirred, turning his head slightly toward her. "You stayed," he murmured, his voice faint but clearer than earlier. Emily met his gaze. "Of course I did." For a moment, nothing moved except the rain. His eyes lingered on her face, studying something he had never let himself look at directly before. She felt warmth rise in her chest, unexpected, unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. "You shouldn't have been alone in here," she added quietly. He let out a slow breath, half exhale, half confession. "I'm used to it." She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "You shouldn't be." He shifted, wincing slightly, and she rose to adjust the pillow behind him. Their proximity created a small bubble of stillness, too intimate, too real. When she stepped back to sit, he spoke again. "My father," he said, voice low, never spoke to me unless he needed something done or corrected. Perfection was his love language. If I achieved it, I earned silence instead of anger. He paused. Silence becomes familiar. Eventually, it becomes home. Emily watched him, the truth settling between them like a fragile piece of glass. I thought, he continued, that if I built enough, earned enough, commanded enough, the silence would feel like choice instead of punishment. His eyes flickered. It never did. She felt her chest tighten. Jonathan! He looked away, jaw tightening not in anger, but in fear of what he had revealed. Vulnerability sat oddly on him, too large, too raw. She swallowed. I've lost myself before, she said softly. Not to power, to people who needed me to be small so they could feel big. I kept giving pieces of myself away until I didn't recognize what was left. She drew in a careful breath. That's why I left corporate. That's why I chose a quieter life. He turned his head back toward her, expression unreadable but intent. I thought marrying you meant disappearing again, she whispered, into responsibility, into someone else's expectations. His brow creased, pain flickering behind his eyes. I never wanted to erase you. You didn't have to want it, she replied. The situation did it for us. They sat in silence, both looking at the window where rain streaked in soft, trembling lines. It was the first time they had spoken without armor. The room felt too small for everything unsaid. Jonathan shifted slightly, lifting a hand as if reaching for something unseen. She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. His fingers curled around hers with a cautious gentleness, as though he feared she might pull away. He swallowed. Emily, I didn't know how to ask for what I wanted. I only knew how to offer security, structure, something to fix the disaster your father was facing. But what I wanted, his voice trailed. She leaned in slightly. What did you want? He exhaled, a long, unsteady breath. A chance. Her pulse thudded. A chance for what? For someone to stay, he said simply. The words were too bare, too honest. They hit her deeper than she expected, cutting through the last thread of distance she'd been holding. She squeezed his hand lightly. Jonathan, I'm here. His eyes softened, the hardness she had grown to expect replaced by something quietly aching. The thunder outside rumbled, a low echo that filled the spaces between them. Hours passed in a hush of softened conversation. He told her about the loneliness he had carried through boardrooms and empty mansions. She told him about the fear of becoming invisible inside someone else's life. Every truth exchanged felt like removing another layer of thick, unspoken history between them. At some point, a nurse dimmed the lights further, leaving only a faint glow illuminating his face. Emily shifted to the edge of the bed, her hand still in his. Emily, he whispered, I don't want this night to vanish like it didn't happen. She felt something inside her loosen a knot she'd carried for years. She slid onto the narrow space beside him, careful not to disturb the monitors. He moved slowly, offering room for her. The closeness felt natural, as though they'd found an answer without needing to seek it. His hand moved to her back, not possessive, not demanding, just warm, steady, human. She rested her forehead against his shoulder, feeling the rise and fall of his breath. The intimacy that followed was not hurried, not heated. It unfolded gently, like two people trying to memorize the feeling of being seen for the first time. They moved slowly, carefully, as if afraid a sudden motion would break the fragile truth hanging between them. Hours later, they lay quietly, listening to the faded echo of the storm. Jonathan brushed a thumb against her cheek, his voice barely audible. Don't walk away after this. Emily closed her eyes, holding his hand against her face. Her heart answered before her mind could. But she didn't speak. She didn't know yet if one night, no matter how honest, was enough to change everything. She only knew she didn't want to move away from him. Not tonight. Not while the rain still tapped softly, asking to be let in. She woke to his arm around her waist, not heavy, but certain. For a moment, she didn't breathe. The early morning light filtered through the hospital blinds in thin, pale stripes, falling across their tangled shapes on the narrow bed. His chest rose and fell against her back, warm and steady. It felt nothing like ownership. It felt like someone afraid to let go. Emily eased her eyes open fully, trying to gather herself. The night before replayed in her memory with disarming clarity the rain, the quiet confessions, the gentleness she had never expected from him. She should have felt calm after such a night. But instead, her pulse raced as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff. Jonathan shifted slightly, tightening his arm in a slow, sleepy reflex. His breath brushed the back of her neck. "You're awake," he murmured, voice rough, vulnerable in a way she had never heard. "Yes," she whispered. He didn't move to release her. She didn't ask him to. For a few seconds, they lay like that, two people suspended between what was safe and what was true. But Emily felt something rising inside her, something she couldn't ignore. Staying here, letting herself melt into him, felt too easy and too dangerous. She gently slid out from under his arm, sitting up with the stiffness of someone who feared their own footsteps. Jonathan's eyes opened fully, following her movement. "Emily," he said softly, "don't disappear on me." She stood, smoothing the blanket, needing the distraction of her hands. "I'm not disappearing. I just need space, a moment to think." His jaw tightened not with anger, but worry. "Last night wasn't a moment to you." "It was," she admitted, turning toward the window. The sky outside was a muted gray, the kind that made the world feel quieter. Maybe too much of one. He sat up slowly, wincing as he adjusted the hospital pillow. Even the simple act hurt him, and she felt a small twisting in her chest. "Emily," he said again, more firmly now, "I'm not losing you after finding you." She closed her eyes. "Jonathan, that's exactly what scares me." He exhaled, frustrated but trying to be gentle. "I'm not talking about contracts or arrangements. I'm talking about us." "There is no us," she whispered, though her voice wavered. "There's circumstance. There's a night born out of fear and vulnerability." "And truth," he countered. "Don't pretend it wasn't truth." She turned to face him. "You can't just decide that for both of us." He held her gaze, unblinking. "Then tell me it meant nothing." Her mouth opened, but the words wouldn't come. She looked away, throat tightening. His voice softened. "Emily, I'm asking you to choose us, not the contract, not your father's debt, just us." Her breath caught, and if I say no, he swallowed, the movement sharp in his throat. "Then I'll step back. But I won't pretend I don't want you. I won't pretend last night didn't happen." She moved toward the chair by the window, sinking into it as if her strength had leaked out. "Jonathan, I built a life where no one had the power to undo me. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And you think I'd take that from you?" His voice cracked in a way she had never heard. "I don't know what you'd take, or what I'd give without meaning to." He stood carefully, his hospital gown loose at the back, his steps slow but determined. He stopped in front of her, not touching her, but close enough she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I don't want to own you," he said softly. "I want you to stay because you want to." She looked up at him, eyes tired, heart aching. "That's exactly why I need distance, to know what I want when I'm not overwhelmed." He nodded once, a small, broken motion. "Then let's go home. You can sleep in your own room. We'll take it slow." "I think I should stay somewhere else tonight," she said quietly. "Just for clarity." His expression changed, not anger, but something deeper, almost fear. "You want to leave the estate for one night?" He took a breath, steadying himself. "Emily," she stood, brushing a hand along her arm. "I'm not running. I just need space to breathe." Jonathan's hand lifted slightly as if he intended to reach for her, but he let it fall before touching her. "Space," he repeated, voice strained. "All right." She nodded, heading toward the door. He watched her, shoulders rigid, but just before she reached the threshold, his voice broke behind her. "You're not trapped anymore," he said, She froze. He whispered, for the first time in my life, I'm trapped in wanting someone who doesn't want me back. Her breath caught painfully. Slowly. She turned. Jonathan stood there, every shield stripped away, looking at her like she was the only thing holding him upright. Something in her chest twisted, sharp and deep. Jonathan, she murmured, but she didn't know what came after. He waited. She couldn't answer. Not yet. She stepped out into the hallway, her heart pounding, her mind spinning, one truth echoing behind every thought. Was she leaving because she needed clarity, or because she was terrified of how much she already felt? For the first time in years, she stood at a podium with her name behind her, not someone else's. The lettering on the banner was simple, dark blue on white, but seeing Emily Warner Art Education Foundation stretched across the stage sent a ripple through her chest. It felt both unreal and strangely peaceful, like stepping into a room she had once dreamed of, but never dared to open. The gallery space smelled faintly of fresh paint and polished wood. Visitors milled about quietly, their murmurs weaving through the soft notes of a piano recording playing somewhere overhead. Students' paintings lined the walls, landscapes, portraits, messy bursts of color from teenagers discovering who they were. It was imperfect, earnest, alive. Emily watched the light fall across the artwork, catching the bright edges of acrylic strokes. A part of her wanted to stand there forever, soaking in the sight, but her father's wheelchair squeaked softly behind her, and she turned. He looked smaller than he once had, frailer, but his eyes, pale and warm and proud, held steady on her. "You ready, Em?" he asked, his voice thin. She knelt beside him, touching his weathered hand. "I think so." "You're more than ready," he murmured. "I just wish your mother could see you today." Emily swallowed. The old grief stirred but didn't hollow her out the way it once did. Today, the ache felt like a companion, not a wound. Guests were beginning to take their seats. She rose, smoothing her slate blue dress, the fabric soft against her palms. Her heart thudded, but it wasn't fear, not the kind that closed her off. It was a trembling, almost tender anticipation. Across the room, Jonathan stood near the back wall. He hadn't taken a seat with the others. He didn't hover near her father. He didn't guide or direct or claim space he shouldn't. He stood almost hidden, hands clasped behind him, dressed simply in a charcoal suit, watching, not possessively, not like a man who believed he had a right to her spotlight, but like someone who knew this was hers. Their eyes met briefly. The quiet in his expression struck something deep inside her, a mix of respect, longing, restraint. He nodded once, telling her without words that he would stay out of the way, that the moment belonged wholly to her. It unsettled her in a soft, unexpected way. Emily stepped toward the podium. The crowd quieted, microphone lights blinked, her breath trembled, but her voice did not when she began. "Thank you all for being here today," she said. Her tone was steady, low, carrying more strength than she remembered having. "This foundation came from a place I never imagined life would take me back to." She spoke of the town she grew up in, of the teacher who first placed a brush in her hand, of the adults she taught in her small class in Wisconsin who believed they were too old to begin again, but tried anyway. She talked about art as something gentle enough to hold grief and sturdy enough to hold hope. Her father dabbed at his eyes. Her voice warmed, softened. "This foundation isn't about talent. It's about giving people, young or old, a place to feel seen." As she continued, she sensed Jonathan at the back of the room. He hadn't moved, not once. A grounded presence, steady and silent. When she finished, the room rose into applause, not loud and wild, but warm, resonant. It washed over her like a tide. She exhaled slowly, a breath that felt years overdue. She stepped away from the podium and moved first to her father. He squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "You did good, kid," he whispered. "Thanks." "Dad." She felt the weight of the moment shift. Something in the air pulled her attention, gentle, insistent. She turned. Jonathan still stood apart from the others, his posture composed but his eyes uncertain, as if he didn't know whether he was allowed to approach her. Emily crossed the distance between them. His breath caught, just slightly, as she came near. The sounds of the crowd blurred behind them. The gallery lights cast a warm glow across his face, softening the lines that responsibility had carved into him. "You didn't come up," she said quietly. "It was your moment." He answered, "I didn't want to take a single inch of it." She looked at him, really looked. This was the man who once scared her with his certainty, his authority, his ability to control a room without raising his voice. But this was also the man who now stood behind the scenes, letting her build something that belonged to her and her alone. Her pulse fluttered. "Jonathan," she said, barely above a whisper. "Yes," he replied, his voice rough, as if bracing himself. Emily reached for his hand, a simple gesture, nothing dramatic, nothing claimed, but it was public, visible, undeniable. His fingers closed around hers slowly, like he feared she might slip away if he moved too fast. The room seemed to inhale around them, though no one interrupted. They stood together in the quiet, hand in hand, their shadows touching on the polished floor. Emily felt her heart inch towards something she had not allowed it to name. But even now, even in this fragile, steadying moment, one question pulsed beneath her ribs. Was this the first step toward a real marriage? Or a moment she still wasn't brave enough to trust? She didn't know yet. But she didn't let go of his hand. Not this time. The lake was calm that evening, as if it had been waiting for them to calm too. The surface glowed gold beneath the fading sun, a slow shimmer that stretched toward the horizon. Emily stood on the wooden deck outside the estate, her small suitcase beside her, the wheels still dusted from the gravel driveway. Returning here felt different this time, not an obligation, not a corner she had been pushed into, but a step she had chosen with a steady, deliberate breath. Jonathan waited at the top of the steps. No suit, no stiff posture, just a man in a gray sweater and worn jeans, shoulders rounded with uncertainty rather than authority. His hand rested lightly on the railing, as if grounding himself. "You came back," he said quietly. Emily lifted her gaze to meet his. Yes. He didn't move closer. He didn't reach for her. For a moment, she saw the hesitance in him, as if he feared that even a step might send her retreating. "I wasn't sure if you wanted me to return," she said softly. His voice cracked around the edges. "I wanted it, but I didn't expect it." She stepped toward him, her suitcase rolling softly behind her. "I didn't come back because of the contract. I know. I didn't come back because you asked me not to walk away. I know that. Too." She stopped on the last step, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "I came back because I want to see what this can become." Jonathan's breath left him in a quiet, uneven exhale. His eyes softened, something vulnerable flickering there, something she hadn't seen in him, even during the hardest conversations in the hospital. Then, "Come inside," he said. But it wasn't an order. It was an invitation. They walked together through the house. The evening light seeped through the tall windows, painting the floor with pale gold shadows. Everything felt familiar, but in a gentler way, like entering a room she once feared and now found herself almost comforted by. She paused in the living room. Someone had placed a vase of lilies on the table, not extravagant, just simple, white, fragrant. Jonathan hovered a few steps behind her. "They were your mother's favorite," he said, his voice quiet. Emily traced the edge of a petal with her fingertips. "You remembered." He nodded once. "You told me last month, when we were talking about her. You said lilies always made you think of her strength. I didn't forget." Her chest tightened in a way that felt both painful and tender. The silence between them wasn't sharp anymore. It was slow, warm, waiting for the right words to fall into place. Jonathan shifted slightly. "Before anything else, I need to say this. I don't expect your trust overnight, and I don't expect your forgiveness if you're not ready to give it. I only want a chance to build something honest." Emily turned toward him. "Then let's start with honesty." He nodded again, bracing himself. "I'm scared." she admitted. The words were thin, but steady. He didn't flinch. So am I. I'm scared of losing myself again, of leaning on someone too much, of waking up one day and realizing my life shrank around a man without me noticing. Jonathan swallowed. Then I'll help you guard your freedom, even when it scares me. Her eyes softened. I don't want distance. I just want partnership. He stepped closer, very slowly. Then partnership is what we build. Emily's gaze drifted around the room, the small stack of art books on the shelf, the quiet hum of the heating system, the view of the lake stretching out like a promise through the window. When she finally met his eyes again, she felt that small, fragile click inside her, the moment when something uncertain steadies. Even just a little. Jonathan, she said gently, you can stop waiting for me to change my mind. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, though it wavered with relief. Just tell me one thing. Are you here tonight, or are you here to stay? Emily reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm, careful, almost reverent. I married you to save a life, she said quietly, but I stay because you saved mine too. His eyes closed for a moment, as if the words were something he needed to hold against his heart. He didn't kiss her. He didn't pull her into his arms. Instead, he lifted her hand to his chest, pressing her palm over the steady, human beat beneath his sweater. They stood there as the last light faded over the lake. The house around them felt different, less like a cage, more like a beginning. No contracts, no negotiations, just two grown, bruised souls trying to build something that neither had learned in their younger years. When she finally rested her head lightly against him, it wasn't surrender, it was choice. Outside, the lake stayed calm, as if reflecting a question they both carried quietly forward. What does love look like when two people choose it freely? After everything that should have broken them, the answer hadn't formed yet. But for the first time, both of them were ready to find out. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, quietly, in the space between two people who have both been hurt more than they ever admitted out loud. What this story gently reminds us is that love doesn't always arrive as a grand, sweeping moment. Sometimes it comes in small, steady gestures, a truth spoken honestly, a hand held without demand, a second chance offered without expectation. And for many of us, especially in the middle years of life, love isn't about starting over. It's about softening into who we've become, wounds and all, and allowing someone to meet us there. It also whispers another tender truth: we don't lose ourselves by letting someone in. We lose ourselves when we stop believing our hearts deserve gentleness. When we find the courage to choose connection, not out of fear, not out of duty, but out of quiet desire, we often discover parts of ourselves we thought were gone forever. And maybe that's the kind of love that endures, not perfect, not easy, but chosen, again and again, with open hands and a steadier heart. If you're holding on to something tender tonight, I hope you feel a little less alone. Thank you, truly, for spending your time with this story. Your presence here matters more than you know. If the journey touched you in any way, a simple like, share, or subscribe helps carry these gentle moments to someone who might need them too. Wishing you peace, warmth, and a soft place to rest your heart tonight.